Power has always flowed through promises, not through armies, not through gold vaults, not through the proclamations of kings, through promises written on paper, sealed with wax, and backed by the faith that tomorrow will honour what today has borrowed. These promises have a name: bonds. And if you think bonds are boring financial instruments traded by men in suits, you have missed one of history's most brutal truths. Bonds have toppled dynasties, funded conquests, and enslaved entire populations. They have built empires that spanned continents and destroyed civilizations that seemed eternal. The bond market is where the real power lives, where the fate of nations is decided not by generals but by creditors. Most people see bonds as safe investments, the boring cousin of flashy stocks. But that perception is exactly what makes them so dangerous. Behind their veneer of stability lies the most sophisticated weapon of financial control ever devised. When you buy a government bond, you are not just making an investment. You are purchasing a piece of that nation's future, a claim on its people's labour, a vote in its political destiny. And throughout history, those who understood this have wielded influence that made emperors look like puppets. The story begins in the merchant republics of medieval Italy, where bankers discovered something revolutionary. Instead of lending money directly to princes and hoping for repayment, they could sell pieces of that debt to other investors. A loan became a tradable asset. Risk was spread, but more importantly, profit was multiplied. The city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Florence pioneered these early bond markets, and their wealth exploded. They were not just trading in goods anymore, they were trading in the promises of kingdoms. Venice perfected this system first. The Venetian Republic created government bonds called prestiti, forcing wealthy citizens to lend money to the state during wartime. But here was the innovation. These loans could be sold to other investors. Suddenly, war debt became a liquid asset. Merchants could profit from conflict without ever drawing a sword. The Venetian bond market became so sophisticated that it attracted investors from across Europe. Foreign capital flowed into Venice, funding its naval supremacy and commercial dominance. The city grew rich not just from trade but from managing the debts of others. Florence followed with even greater ambition. The Medici family built their banking empire on government bonds, lending to kings across Europe and then selling shares of those debts to investors. When Edward III of England needed money for his wars with France, Florentine bankers provided it, not as charity, but as business. The bonds they created from those royal debts became some of the most valuable assets in medieval Europe. The Medici were not just bankers. They were bond dealers, and their customers included popes, princes and merchants from London to Constantinople. But this system came with a fatal flaw. When kings defaulted, entire banking houses collapsed. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks, once titans of Florentine finance, were destroyed when Edward III refused to honour his debts. Thousands of investors lost everything. Florence learned a harsh lesson. Bonds could create immense wealth, but they could also transfer devastating losses across entire economies. The promise of easy profit came with the risk of total ruin. The real breakthrough came in the 17th century, when the Dutch Republic transformed bonds from a risky gamble into the foundation of state power. Fighting for independence from Spain, the Dutch faced a problem. Wars cost money, but traditional taxation could not fund a conflict that might last decades. The solution was brilliant and terrifying: permanent government debt. Instead of borrowing for specific campaigns, the Dutch state began issuing bonds that never had to be repaid, only serviced with interest payments. Investors bought these bonds not expecting to get their principal back, but to receive steady returns forever. This changed everything. Suddenly, the Dutch Republic could wage war indefinitely, limited not by the gold in its treasury, but by its ability to convince investors of its creditworthiness. The bond market became the engine of Dutch military power. Ships were built, soldiers were paid, and colonies were conquered, all funded by pieces of paper promising future payments. The Dutch East India Company, the most profitable corporation in history, was itself a giant bond-issuing machine selling shares and debt to finance its global empire. Other nations watched in amazement, and terror. The Dutch were outspending larger, richer kingdoms because they had unlocked the secret of financial warfare. Wars were no longer contests of existing wealth. They were competitions to borrow against future prosperity. The nation that could inspire the most confidence in its bonds could field the largest armies and the most powerful fleets. Military strength became inseparable from financial credibility. England, threatened by Dutch naval dominance, copied and perfected the model. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694 institutionalised permanent government debt as the cornerstone of state finance. English bonds, backed by parliamentary taxation powers, became the bedrock of global finance. The British Empire was not built on superior weapons or braver soldiers. It was built on superior bonds. London's ability to borrow cheaply funded the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy protected the trade routes that generated the wealth to service those bonds. It was a perfect cycle of debt, power, and profit. By the 18th century, this financial revolution had spread across Europe, but nowhere was its power more visible than in the rise and fall of France. The French monarchy, watching Britain's success with envy, attempted to replicate the English model. But where Britain had parliamentary control over taxation, France had absolute monarchy and a tax system riddled with exemptions for the nobility. French bonds carried higher interest rates because investors understood the risk. The Crown could promise payments, but could it actually collect the taxes needed to honour those promises? The answer came during the 7 Years' War, when France and Britain fought what was essentially the world's first global bond war. Both nations borrowed massively to fund armies in Europe, navies on the oceans, and campaigns in North America and India. But while British bonds remained stable, backed by reliable tax collection, French bonds began to wobble. Investors demanded higher returns to compensate for growing doubt about French finances. The gap widened with each passing year. Britain could borrow at 4% while France paid 8 or 9% for the same privilege. This difference seems small, but it was devastating. Higher borrowing costs meant France had to dedicate ever larger portions of its budget to debt service. Money that should have gone to armies and infrastructure instead flowed to bondholders. By the 1780s, nearly half of French government spending went to paying interest on old debts. The monarchy was trapped in a death spiral, borrowing new money just to pay the interest on previous borrowings. When Jacques Necker, the finance minister, finally published the government's accounts, the numbers were shocking. France was spending more on debt payments than on its entire military. The crisis exploded in 1789, but not in the way most people remember. The French Revolution was not just about liberty and equality. It was about bonds. The Third Estate, representing commoners, refused to pay taxes to service debts they had not authorised. They argued that bonds issued by the monarchy were the monarchy's problem, not the nation's obligation. When the revolutionaries seized power, they faced a choice: honour the old regime's debts or repudiate them entirely. The decision split the revolutionary movement and ultimately shaped the revolution's trajectory. Initially, the revolutionaries tried to honour existing bonds while issuing new ones backed by confiscated church lands. These assignats were supposed to restore financial stability, but they became the instrument of France's economic destruction. The government printed them in massive quantities, and their value collapsed. Bondholders who had trusted the new regime found their investments worthless. The financial chaos contributed to the terror as desperate leaders searched for scapegoats to blame for the economic catastrophe. Meanwhile, Britain exploited France's financial weakness ruthlessly. While French bonds became worthless paper, British consols remained rock-solid investments. London's bond market attracted capital from across Europe, including money fleeing the chaos in France. British investors grew wealthy buying French assets at fire sale prices, while French savers saw their wealth evaporate. The bond market had become a weapon of war more effective than any cannon. Napoleon understood this lesson perfectly. When he seized power, one of his first acts was to restore confidence in French bonds. He established the Bank of France, restructured government debt, and most importantly, demonstrated that France could and would pay its obligations. French bonds recovered, giving Napoleon the financial resources to wage war across Europe for over a decade. His armies marched on borrowed money just as surely as they marched on their stomachs. But Napoleon also learned that bonds could be turned against him. When European coalitions fought the French Empire, they did so with British gold borrowed through London's bond market. The Duke of Wellington famously said that Waterloo was won not on the playing fields of Eton, but in the counting houses of the City of London. British bondholders had financed not just their own victory, but the defeat of their greatest rival. The pattern was now clear and would repeat throughout the 19th century. Nations with deep, liquid bond markets could project power far beyond their immediate resources. They could fight longer wars, build larger navies, and expand their empires. Countries with weak bond markets remained regional powers, constrained by their immediate wealth. The global balance of power had shifted from those who owned the most gold to those who could borrow the most money at the cheapest rates. This financial arms race accelerated during the Industrial Revolution. Railroads, factories, and infrastructure projects required massive upfront investments that no individual or company could provide. Bonds became the mechanism for pooling capital from thousands of small investors to fund enormous projects. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Suez Canal, and the expansion of European industry all depended on bond markets. Nations that could efficiently channel savings into productive investments through their bond markets grew rapidly. Those that could not fell behind. The lesson echoes across every century since. From Venice's Prestiti to London's consols, from Napoleon's war bonds to today's sovereign debt markets, the same truth emerges. Those who control the bond markets control the fate of nations. Empires rise when they can borrow cheaply and fall when that trust evaporates. The Spanish Empire collapsed under its debts to Genoese bankers. The Ottoman Empire became the sick man of Europe when it could no longer service its bonds. The Soviet Union crumbled partly because it had no access to global capital markets, while the United States became a superpower by making its bonds the world's safest investment. Today, the game has only grown more elaborate. The same promises that funded Venetian galleys and British warships now power entire economies. But the players have changed. Kings no longer sign decrees. Central bankers adjust interest rates. And instead of parchments sealed in wax, the promises are digital, traded in milliseconds by algorithms across oceans of data. The bond market still rules. When America borrows, the world listens. US Treasuries are now what Venetian prestiti once were. The ultimate symbol of trust. They back pensions in Europe, corporate loans in Asia, and the savings of families who will never know the system they depend on. Every time Washington raises or lowers its debt ceiling, the tremors reach from Frankfurt to Shanghai. The empire of bonds never died. It just went global. China holds over $1 trillion in US debt. Japan, another $1 trillion. Nations that once fought wars over land now compete over interest rates. Their power lies not in the size of their armies, but in the confidence of investors. The battlefield is the bond yield curve. The victors are those who can borrow forever, but beneath the surface the same danger still lurks. Every empire believes its debt is different, that it can always pay tomorrow. Yet history whispers the same warning. Trust is not infinite. When confidence cracks, the paper fortress collapses. The Medici fell. France burned. The British pound surrendered its crown to the dollar, and one day the dollar may pass that crown on to another. Because empires do not end with invasion. They end when their promises lose value. Bonds built Venice. They bankrolled Napoleon. They crowned Britain. And they sustain America. Every empire is built on borrowed time, and the interest is still accruing. If this opened your eyes to how debt shapes power, hit subscribe. Every empire runs on borrowed time, and the next one is already signing the papers.